In the ancient world, nestled in a lush and fertile plain, there stood a city that seemed to have everything. This city was Sodom. It was a place of great wealth, a hub of commerce where caravans from distant lands brought treasures, spices, and fine fabrics. Its streets buzzed with activity, its markets overflowed with goods, and its people lived in comfort and luxury. From a distance, Sodom looked like a paradise, a shining example of human success and prosperity. Its buildings were grand, and the sound of music and laughter often filled the air. It was a city that appeared to be blessed, a place where dreams of riches could come true for anyone bold enough to seek them. But beneath this gleaming surface, a deep darkness was taking root. The wealth of Sodom did not bring gratitude or humility to its people. Instead, it fed a great and terrible pride. The citizens began to believe that their success was entirely their own doing, that they were masters of their own destiny, beyond the reach of any higher power. They saw their prosperity not as a gift, but as a right. This arrogance poisoned their hearts and minds, causing them to look down on others with contempt. They became a people who trusted only in their own strength and their own desires, forgetting the very foundations of kindness and respect. The city's altars, where one might expect to find prayers of thanks, stood empty and cold. The spiritual life of Sodom had withered away, replaced by a relentless pursuit of earthly pleasure. The people lived for the moment, chasing every desire that entered their minds without a second thought for the consequences. They believed they were a law unto themselves, that their city was so powerful that not even God could challenge their way of life. This profound spiritual blindness made them deaf to any warnings and closed their hearts to any form of correction. They were rich in gold and goods, but utterly bankrupt in spirit and virtue. This combination of immense wealth and deep-seated arrogance created a dangerous environment. Sodom became a city without limits, where any behavior, no matter how selfish or cruel, was acceptable as long as it brought pleasure or power. The very concept of right and wrong began to blur, replaced by the simple rule of might makes right. The city's vibrant energy, once a sign of its success, now fueled a culture of excess and indulgence. Sodom was a beautiful shining trap, drawing people in with promises of fortune only to corrupt them with its deep, underlying sinfulness. It was a city on a collision course with destiny. Far from the noise and corruption of Sodom, a man named Abraham lived a simple, nomadic life. He was a man of deep and unwavering faith, known for his close relationship with God. Abraham was not a king or a conqueror, but his wisdom and righteousness were respected by all who knew him. He lived in tents, moving with his flocks across the land as God guided him. It was during this quiet life of devotion that he received a visit that would forever link his name to the fate of Sodom. 3 mysterious visitors appeared before his tent, who were later revealed to be 2 angels and the Lord himself in a divine form. The visitors brought with them a heavy and alarming message. They revealed to Abraham that a great cry had risen up from the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. The sins of the people had become so great, their wickedness so profound, that a divine judgment was now unavoidable. The Lord declared his intention to go down and see if the corruption was as complete as the report suggested, and if so, to bring destruction upon them. For Abraham, this news was deeply troubling. His own nephew Lot lived in Sodom with his family, and Abraham's heart was filled with concern for the inhabitants of the city, despite their wickedness. Instead of simply accepting the grim verdict, Abraham stepped forward and began to speak with God. This was not a conversation of equals, but a humble and heartfelt plea for mercy. He questioned the very nature of divine justice, asking, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" He was worried that innocent people might be destroyed alongside the guilty. This act showed Abraham's incredible compassion and his deep understanding of justice. He was not just trying to save his family, he was interceding for the soul of an entire city, hoping that some goodness could still be found within its walls. Abraham then began to bargain with God, a negotiation born of desperation and hope. He started by asking if the city would be spared if 50 righteous people were found there. The Lord agreed. Encouraged, Abraham continued, lowering the number again and again. Would God spare it for 45, for 40, for 30, for 20? Finally, with great humility, he asked if the city would be spared for the sake of just 10 righteous people. Each time the Lord agreed, showing his immense patience and mercy. But the divine verdict was already sealed, for not even 10 good people could be found in the city. The story of how Lot came to live in Sodom begins with a simple family matter that grew into a life-altering decision. Lot was Abraham's nephew, and he had traveled with his uncle for many years. Both men had become very wealthy, with vast herds of sheep and cattle. Their flocks grew so large that the land they shared could no longer support them both. Fights began to break out between Abraham's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen over grazing land and watering holes. To keep peace in the family, the wise Abraham proposed that they should separate and go their own ways, allowing Lot to choose his path first. Abraham gave his nephew the first choice of the land before them. From their vantage point, Lot looked out and saw the entire plain of the Jordan River. It was a lush, green and well-watered valley, appearing as beautiful and fertile as the garden of the Lord. This rich land, which included the city of Sodom, seemed to promise even greater prosperity and an easier life. Lot made his choice based on what he could see with his own eyes, captivated by the promise of material wealth. He did not seek divine guidance or consider the character of the people who lived there. He chose the path that looked most appealing on the surface. So, Lot packed up his tents, gathered his family and his flocks, and journeyed eastward. He initially pitched his tents near Sodom, drawn by the allure of the thriving city. Over time, however, the separation between his camp and the city began to dissolve. The convenience and opportunities of city life were too tempting to resist. Slowly but surely, Lot and his family moved from the outskirts into the city itself, becoming integrated into its culture. What began as a practical choice for better pasture land evolved into a complete immersion in a society that was spiraling into moral decay. He had chosen prosperity over piety. Lot eventually became a respected figure in Sodom, so much so that he sat among the city elders at the main gate. This was a position of authority and influence where legal matters were decided and business was conducted. By taking on this role, Lot had become a part of the city's structure, a participant in its daily life and governance. While he may have remained personally righteous in his heart, he was now deeply entangled in a community whose values were directly opposed to everything his uncle Abraham stood for. His choice, made years earlier in the Green Valley, had led him and his family right into the heart of a city destined for judgment. The sins that condemned Sodom were not a single act but a deep and pervasive culture of corruption that had festered over time. At the heart of this decay was the sin of idolatry. The markers of faith and reverence for a higher power had been torn down and replaced with grotesque statues of pagan gods. The people of Sodom engaged in rituals that were not only empty but often cruel and depraved. They worshipped obscure deities that demanded heinous acts, including, according to some traditions, the sacrifice of children. This rejection of the one true God opened the door for every other form of wickedness to enter and flourish within the city's walls. This spiritual rebellion led directly to a breakdown of social justice. In Sodom, the courts were a mockery of fairness. Verdicts were not based on evidence or morality, but were sold to the highest bidder. Justice could be bought with gold, favors, or flesh. The most vulnerable members of society, the poor, the widows, and the orphans, had no one to defend them. Their cries for help were silenced, and they were oppressed and exploited by the rich and powerful. The city's leaders, who were supposed to uphold the law, were often the most corrupt of all, using their positions to enrich themselves and crush anyone who stood in their way. The moral fabric of Sodom was further shredded by rampant sexual depravity. The people openly defied the natural order, with men burning with lust for other men and women engaging in similar acts. These desires were not hidden in shame but were paraded in the open, celebrated as a form of liberation. They took what they wanted by force, and unrestrained desire was considered a virtue rather than a vice. The very concept of hospitality, a sacred duty in the ancient world, was twisted into an opportunity for assault. This collective defiance of created order was a direct insult to the Creator himself, showing a complete disregard for his design. All of these sins were fueled by an overwhelming arrogance and a culture of cruelty. The pride of Sodom was not just about wealth, it was rooted in the desire to dominate and humiliate others. Strangers and foreigners who entered the city were not welcomed but were seen as objects for sport or exploitation. They were often tested, and if they showed any weakness, they were corrupted or destroyed. This cruelty was not random, but was a central part of the city's identity. They delighted in the suffering of others because it made them feel powerful. The city had become a place where kindness was seen as weakness and cruelty was a sign of strength. As evening began to fall over the wicked city of Sodom, Two strangers arrived at the city gate. These were no ordinary travelers. They were the two angels who had spoken with Abraham earlier that day, now appearing in the form of men. They had come on a mission to witness the city's corruption firsthand before carrying out the divine judgment. At the gate, they were seen by Lot, who was sitting there in his role as a city elder. Unlike the other citizens of Sodom, Lot immediately recognized something different about these visitors. He saw a holiness in them, a purity that stood in stark contrast to the city's atmosphere. Driven by a sense of duty and genuine concern, Lot stood up and bowed low to the ground to greet them. He insisted that they not spend the night in the open city square as they had planned. Lot knew the dangers that lurked in the streets of Sodom after dark. He understood that two vulnerable-looking strangers would become targets for the violent and depraved men of the city. He urged them to come to his home, where he could offer them food, a place to wash their feet, and most importantly, the protection of his roof. His insistence showed that despite living in Sodom, he had not completely lost his sense of decency and hospitality. The angels initially tested Lot's resolve, telling him they preferred to stay in the square, but Lot pleaded with them earnestly, knowing the grave danger they would be in. His persistence convinced them, and they agreed to accompany him to his house. Once there, Lot prepared a feast for them, and baked unleavened bread, treating them with the honor and respect due to special guests. For a brief moment, it seemed that a small pocket of civility and safety existed within the corrupt city. Lot was trying to be a shield, protecting these holy visitors from the darkness that he knew was waiting just outside his door. However, the peace within Lot's home was short-lived. Before the guests could even lie down to rest for the night, the house was surrounded. It was not just a few troublemakers, it was a mob composed of men from every part of the city, both young and old. The entire male population of Sodom had come together with a single, sinister purpose. They began to pound on the door, their voices rising in a furious clamor. The wickedness that Lot had tried to keep at bay had now arrived on his doorstep, threatening to consume him and his guests in its violent rage. The mob outside Lot's house grew louder and more aggressive. Their shouts filled the night air with a terrifying demand. "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" they yelled. "Bring them out to us so that we may know them." The phrase "to know them" was not a request for an introduction. It was a brutal and explicit demand for a collective sexual assault. This was the ultimate violation of hospitality and human dignity. The men of Sodom, driven by their unrestrained lust, intended to humiliate and violate the strangers who had sought shelter in their city. Their demand revealed the absolute depth of their depravity. Trapped between his sacred duty to protect his guests and the violent mob at his door, Lot made a desperate and shocking decision. He went outside, shutting the door behind him to shield the angels, and faced the angry crowd alone. He pleaded with them, calling them brothers in a futile attempt to appeal to their better nature. "No, my friends," he begged, "don't do this wicked thing." His words, however, fell on deaf ears. The mob was not interested in reason or morality, they were consumed by their lust and rage, and they saw Lot as an obstacle to their desires. In his moment of sheer desperation, Lot made a horrifying offer, one that shows just how deeply the culture of Sodom had twisted his own thinking. He said to the mob, "Look, I have two daughters who have never known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." This terrible proposal, offering his own virgin daughters to a violent mob to save his male guests, reveals the corrupted priorities of the time and the extreme pressure Lot was under. He valued the safety of his guests over that of his own children. The mob, however, completely rejected Lot's offer. Their rage was not just about lust, it was about power and domination. They were furious that Lot, an outsider himself, would dare to judge them or stand in their way. "Get out of our way," they shouted. "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them." They surged forward, ready to break down the door and assault not only the angels but Lot as well. The situation had escalated from a threat to an imminent violent attack, and Lot was powerless to stop them. Just as the mob was about to overpower Lot and break down the door, divine power intervened. The two angels inside reached out, pulled a terrified Lot back into the house, and slammed the door shut. In an instant, they demonstrated their true otherworldly nature. They struck the entire crowd of men outside, both young and old, with a sudden and disorienting blindness. The men who had been moments away from violent assault were now groping aimlessly in the dark, unable to even find the doorway. Their wicked intentions were thwarted not by human strength but by a swift and decisive act of supernatural power. Once Lot and his family were safely inside, the angels revealed the full and terrifying truth of their mission. They were not mere travelers, they were agents of divine destruction. "We are going to destroy this place," they declared. "The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it." The time for bargaining and pleading was over. Judgment was no longer a distant threat, it was an immediate reality. They instructed Lot to act quickly and gather anyone who belonged to him in the city, his sons-in-law, his daughters, and anyone else in his household, and get them out. Lot rushed to warn his sons-in-law, who were engaged to marry his daughters. He found them and delivered the urgent message: "Hurry and get out of this place, because the Lord is about to destroy the city." But his words were met with scorn and disbelief. They thought he was joking. They had become so comfortable in Sodom, so integrated into its culture of pride and skepticism, that they could not comprehend the idea of divine judgment. Their laughter in the face of this dire warning sealed their fate. They chose to stay, blinded by the city's illusion of permanence and power. As the dawn began to break, the angels grew more urgent. Lot was hesitating, perhaps sorrowful about leaving his home and his possessions behind. Seeing his delay, the angels acted out of mercy from the Lord. They seized Lot by the hand, along with the hands of his wife and his 2 daughters, and physically led them out of the city to safety. Once outside, the command was clear and absolute. "Flee for your lives! Don't look back, and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains or you will be swept away." Their escape was not a casual departure, it was a desperate flight from certain doom. As Lot and his family fled from the doomed city, the final moments of Sodom and Gomorrah arrived. The sun had risen over the land, casting its morning light on a scene that was about to be erased from existence forever. As soon as Lot had reached the safety of the small town of Zoar, the Lord unleashed his judgment. It did not come in the form of an earthquake or a flood, but as a terrifying storm from the heavens. The sky turned dark as the Lord rained down burning sulfur and fire upon Sodom and Gomorrah and the entire surrounding plain. The destruction was absolute and instantaneous. Everything was consumed by the heavenly fire. The grand buildings, the bustling markets, the lush vegetation of the valley, it all vanished in a storm of flame. The very ground was scorched, turning a once fertile paradise into a desolate, smoking wasteland. The screams of the wicked were silenced as the fire consumed them, wiping out every trace of the corrupt civilization that had defied God for so long. Abraham, watching from a distance, saw a thick smoke rising from the plain, like the smoke from a gigantic furnace. The judgment was complete. During the desperate escape, Lot's family had been given one strict command: do not look back. This was not just a practical instruction to keep them moving forward, it was a spiritual test. To look back would be to show that one's heart was still attached to the sinful world being destroyed, that the love of earthly things was stronger than the desire for salvation. Lot and his daughters obeyed, their eyes fixed on the path ahead. But Lot's wife could not resist the temptation. Her life, her friends, and her possessions were all in Sodom, and her heart longed for what she was leaving behind. Disobeying the angel's direct command, Lot's wife paused and looked back at the burning city. In that instant, divine judgment fell upon her as well. She was immediately transformed into a pillar of salt, a stark and silent monument frozen on the desolate plain. Her fate serves as a powerful and chilling reminder of the consequences of disobedience and a divided heart. She was physically saved from the city, but her soul was still tied to it. She stands as an eternal warning to all who would start on the path to salvation, but then long for the world they left behind. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is far more than just an ancient tale of destruction. It is a profound lesson about the nature of choices and their unavoidable consequences. The people of Sodom chose a life of pride, cruelty, and self-indulgence. They believed they could live without limits and without accountability. Their ultimate fate demonstrates a universal truth, that actions, whether good or bad, will always yield a result. Their thriving city was turned to ash not by chance but as a direct consequence of the culture they had built. This story reminds us that we are all architects of our own destiny, and the choices we make matter deeply. At the same time, the narrative reveals a powerful truth about the character of God. It shows a God who is perfectly just, one who will not allow wickedness to go unchecked forever. The outcry against the city's sin was heard, and judgment was delivered. Yet this same story is filled with examples of incredible mercy. We see it in God's willingness to spare the city for the sake of just 10 righteous people. We see it in Abraham's bold intercession which God patiently listened to, and we see it most clearly when the angels physically drag a hesitating Lot and his family to safety, saving them when they could not save themselves. The aftermath of the escape also carries a somber lesson. Lot was saved from the fire, but he could not completely escape the influence of Sodom. Fearing for his life even in the town of Zoar, he fled to a cave in the mountains with his 2 daughters. There, in isolation, his daughters, believing the entire world had been destroyed, committed a terrible act born of desperation, leading to the birth of nations who would become enemies of God's people. This shows that even when we are physically removed from a corrupting environment, its spiritual and psychological effects can linger, impacting our decisions and our future in tragic ways. Ultimately, the destruction of these cities without limits echoes through time as a powerful call to choose our path wisely. It challenges us to look beyond the surface appeal of wealth and pleasure, and to consider the moral foundation of our lives and our societies. The story teaches that true strength is found, not in arrogance and power but in humility, justice, and compassion. It is a timeless reminder that while mercy is always available, justice is inevitable, and the choices we make each day are what truly build our world and determine our final destination.